The city burns beneath a blood-red sky. Warriors storm through shattered gates with bronze weapons raised. Smoke rises from collapsed towers along the coast. Behind them, black ships crowd the harbor. This is not the Troy you know. This is Wilusa, crown jewel of Luwian civilization. The Greeks called it Troy in their songs. The Hittites called it Wilusa in their treaties. But the people who built it called themselves Luwians. They spoke a language lost for 3,000 years. They controlled trade routes that linked 3 continents. They built cities that rivaled Mycenae and Memphis. Yet until recently, historians barely knew they existed. Everything you know about the Bronze Age is wrong. The civilization that controlled Western Anatolia was not Greek. It was not Hittite either. It was Luwian, a culture so vast it covered more territory than ancient Greece. Recent discoveries have identified 483 major Luwian settlements. Most remain unexcavated, buried under Turkish farmland. The evidence scattered across these sites rewrites Mediterranean history. It suggests the Trojan War was not Greeks against Trojans. It was Greeks against Luwians, a conflict between 2 great civilizations competing for Mediterranean dominance. Western Anatolia, 1500 years before Christ. The Bronze Age Mediterranean connects Egypt to Mycenae to Mesopotamia. Great empires trade copper, tin, and slaves. They form alliances and wage wars. But between the Hittite heartland and the Greek islands lies a forgotten realm. The Luwian kingdoms stretch from the Aegean coast deep into Anatolia. Their cities command strategic harbors and mountain passes. Their merchants grow wealthy from international trade. Their warriors fight for regional dominance. Who were these Luwians? Why did historians overlook them for so long? How did they shape the Trojan War? What role did they play in civilization's collapse? This documentary answers these questions with evidence that emerged only recently. We will journey from peaceful Bronze Age cities to apocalyptic battlefields. We will trace the Luwians from obscurity to dominance to destruction. By the end, you will understand how this forgotten civilization influenced the ancient world. You will see how they may have sparked the Bronze Age collapse, and you will discover why their story matters today. Watch as Luwian kingdoms forge dangerous alliances. See Troy's walls tested by Greek fury. Witness the moment when peace becomes impossible. Experience the battles that shattered the Bronze Age. Discover archaeological evidence that changes everything. Follow the search for answers across Turkey's hidden ruins. Learn how one seal discovered in Troy's ashes proved the city spoke Luwian. And witness the catastrophic chain of events that brought an entire civilization crashing down. The Mediterranean world seems stable in 1300 BC. Trade routes connect distant kingdoms in complex webs. Egyptian gold flows north, while Anatolian silver flows south. Peace treaties bind former enemies in mutual interest. But beneath this prosperity, pressure builds toward catastrophe. The Luwian kingdoms of Western Anatolia control critical resources. They dominate the Aegean trade routes. Their cities grow wealthy and powerful, and they begin to challenge their neighbors. The Luwians are not one unified empire. They are a confederation of city-states and kingdoms. Each rules its own territory independently. Azawa controls the southwestern coast and its fertile valleys. Mira commands the west-central highlands and mountain passes. Seha River dominates the northwestern approaches to the Hellespont. Hapala holds the mountainous interior with its mineral wealth. And Wilusa, which Greeks call Troy, guards the strategic Dardanelles. These kingdoms share language, culture, and hieroglyphic writing. They worship similar gods with sacred mountains. They ally when threatened by outside powers. Together they form a civilization rivaling the Hittites. The Luwian language spreads across Western Anatolia like water. It belongs to the Anatolian branch of Indo-European languages. It shares distant roots with Greek and Sanskrit. Archaeologists have discovered Luwian hieroglyphic inscriptions across hundreds of sites. These inscriptions appear on seals, monuments, and rock faces. They record royal decrees, religious dedications, and territorial claims. The script combines logograms and syllabic signs in complex patterns. Decipherment began in the 20th century through comparative linguistics. Today, scholars can read most Luwian texts with confidence. The language reveals a sophisticated culture with written records and bureaucracy. Wilusa rises on a strategic hill overlooking the Dardanelles. The city's massive walls tower 30 feet high. 6 great gates allow controlled access to the interior. Inside, palatial buildings house the ruling dynasty. Merchants conduct business in crowded marketplaces below the citadel. Craftsmen produce pottery, textiles, and bronze weapons. The population may reach 10,000 at its peak. The location gives Wilusa enormous strategic importance. Ships passing between the Aegean and Black Sea must navigate these treacherous straits. Strong currents and unpredictable winds force vessels to wait for favorable conditions. Wilusa controls this bottleneck and charges fees for passage. The city grows wealthy from maritime tolls and overland trade. To the east, the Hittite Empire dominates central Anatolia. The Hittite capital Hattusa commands a highland plateau with natural defenses. The Hittite king rules as overlord of vassal kingdoms. Treaties inscribed on clay tablets document these relationships. Many Luwian kingdoms acknowledge Hittite supremacy through formal agreements. The Alexandru Treaty between Hattusili III and King Alexandru of Wilusa survives today. It establishes Wilusa as a Hittite vassal state. It promises mutual military support against outside threats. It defines territorial boundaries and tribute obligations, but the treaty also reveals Wilusa's importance to Hittite strategy. The Hittites need Wilusa to buffer their empire from Western threats. To the west, Mycenaean Greece flourishes on the mainland and islands. Mycenaean palaces dominate fortified citadels at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. These kingdoms control rich agricultural lands and maritime trade. Greek merchants sail east seeking copper, tin, and luxury goods. They establish trading posts along the Anatolian coast. Competition with Luwian merchants increases as both cultures expand. Archaeological evidence shows extensive contact between Greeks and Luwians. Mycenaean pottery appears in Luwian cities throughout the coast. Luwian goods reach Greece through established trade networks. But peaceful trade coexists with military tension along contested borders. Around 1280 BC, something shifts in the regional balance. The Hittite Empire weakens under internal pressures and external threats. Succession disputes divide the royal family in Hattusa. Border wars drain military resources in multiple directions. The empire's grip on its western vassals begins to loosen. Luwian kingdoms sense opportunity in Hittite weakness. They begin acting more independently from their overlords. Some withhold tribute or ignore treaty obligations. Others expand their territories into disputed regions. The careful diplomatic balance maintained for generations starts to crumble. Azawa grows particularly bold in its challenge to authority. The kingdom controls rich agricultural lands and important harbors. Its rulers have long chafed under Hittite dominance. Now they see a chance to assert full independence. Azawa begins forming its own alliance system among Luwian states. It offers protection to smaller kingdoms in exchange for loyalty. It encourages resistance to Hittite demands throughout the region. The Hittites watch this development with growing alarm. They cannot afford to lose control of Western Anatolia. The resources and strategic position are too valuable to surrender. Meanwhile, Mycenaean Greeks observe these developments with keen interest. They see opportunity in the growing chaos of Anatolia. For years, they have competed with Luwians for Mediterranean dominance. Now, the balance of power seems vulnerable to disruption. Greek merchants report back from trading missions with intelligence. They describe wealthy cities, political tensions, and weakening alliances. Greek rulers begin planning more aggressive expansion eastward. They identify potential allies among discontented Luwian factions. They calculate the cost of military expeditions against coastal cities. Wilusa becomes the focal point of escalating tensions. The city's strategic position attracts attention from all sides. The Hittites need Wilusa to maintain their western buffer zone. The Luwian Confederation needs it to control maritime trade. The Greeks covet its wealth and strategic location. Multiple powers compete for influence over Wilusa's ruling dynasty. Marriage alliances, tribute agreements, and military threats all play roles. The city's fate becomes tied to the broader power struggle. What happens at Wilusa will determine the region's future. A diplomatic incident sparks the crisis that changes everything. The details remain unclear even to modern historians. Ancient sources hint at broken treaties and violated oaths. Greek legends speak of abducted royalty and demands for return. Hittite records mention rebellious vassals and punitive expeditions. Luwian inscriptions reference attacks and defensive alliances. Whatever the exact cause, the result is clear. Around 1250 BC, diplomatic relations collapse between the major powers. The careful balance maintained for generations shatters beyond repair. Wilusa faces an impossible choice between competing demands. The Hittites insist on loyalty to their treaty obligations. The Luwian Confederation urges resistance to outside dominance. The Greeks make threats veiled in diplomatic language. The city's leaders must decide which alliance offers survival. They calculate military strength, geographic factors, and political reliability. The wrong choice means destruction for their city. The right choice might not exist at all. As spring arrives in 1250 BC, armies begin to mobilize. Ships are fitted for war across the Aegean. Bronze weapons are forged in unprecedented quantities. Diplomatic messages become increasingly hostile in tone. The Mycenaean kingdoms coordinate their military planning for the first time. King Agamemnon of Mycenae emerges as the coalition leader. He calls upon allied Greek kingdoms to contribute ships and warriors. The response exceeds all expectations for unity. Dozens of Greek cities commit to the expedition. They mobilize the largest fleet ever assembled in Aegean waters. The target becomes clear: Wilusa must fall. The Greeks aim to break Luwian power and establish dominance. They intend to capture the strategic Dardanelles permanently. They plan to plunder the city's legendary wealth. As summer approaches, the Greek fleet gathers at Aulis. Over 1,000 ships assemble in the harbor. 50,000 warriors prepare for the expedition eastward. Supplies are loaded for a campaign of unknown duration. Priests perform sacrifices, seeking divine favor for the journey. The sight of so many ships terrifies and impresses observers. Nothing on this scale has been attempted before. The commitment of resources indicates desperate strategic necessity. This is not a raid for plunder alone. This is a war to reshape the Mediterranean world. In Wilusa, sentries spot the approaching fleet on the horizon. The black ships stretch across the Aegean like a dark cloud. The sight sends messengers racing to the palace. Alarms sound throughout the city as citizens rush to their posts. Warriors man the great walls with weapons ready. Women and children evacuate to the citadel's upper levels. King Priam convenes his council to assess the situation. They send urgent appeals to Lusian allies and Hittite overlords. Help must arrive before the Greeks land their forces. The Greek fleet beaches on the plain below Wilusa's walls. Warriors disembark in perfect formations, honed through years of training. They set up fortified camps along the shore. They begin unloading supplies for a protracted siege. The Luwians watch from the walls in grim silence. The largest army ever assembled now surrounds their city. The siege of Wilusa has begun. The fate of an entire civilization hangs in balance. But this is only the beginning of what would become. Within weeks of the Greek landing, the situation spirals beyond control. The siege settles into brutal routine as seasons change. Greek warriors raid the surrounding countryside for supplies and plunder. Luwian defenders launch counterattacks from the city gates. Casualties mount on both sides without decisive advantage. The war everyone expected to end quickly extends into years. Neither side anticipated the enormous cost about to unfold. The defenders of Wilusa fight with desperate courage and cunning. King Priam coordinates the defense from his palace citadel. His son Hector emerges as the city's greatest warrior. Hector leads sorties that inflict heavy casualties on the Greeks. He personally defeats numerous Greek champions in single combat. His tactical brilliance keeps the siege from becoming a stranglehold. The population rallies behind his leadership and example. Women, children, and elders all contribute to the defense. They repair walls damaged by Greek assault engines. They tend the wounded and produce weapons without rest. The Greek coalition faces unexpected challenges maintaining unity and morale. King Agamemnon struggles to control ambitious subordinate commanders. Achilles, the greatest Greek warrior, quarrels constantly with overall strategy. Other Greek leaders pursue personal glory over coordinated tactics. Supply lines stretch across the Aegean back to Greece. Disease spreads through the crowded military camps along the shore. Warriors grow weary of fighting far from their homes. Some question whether the war's objectives justify the mounting costs. Across western Anatolia, Luwian kingdoms mobilize to support their besieged ally. Arzawa sends reinforcements overland toward the Dardanelles. Mira contributes warriors, supplies, and diplomatic pressure on the Hittites. Seha River guards the northern approaches against potential Greek flanking moves. The Luwian Confederation functions as it was designed. Individual kingdoms coordinate military action despite their independence. They recognize that Wilusa's fall threatens them all. If the Greeks succeed, every Luwian city becomes vulnerable. Relief forces clash with Greek contingents patrolling the surrounding territory. Battles erupt in valleys, mountain passes, and coastal plains. The Greeks cannot fully encircle Wilusa while maintaining their siege lines. Luwian supplies and reinforcements filter through gaps in Greek positions. The siege becomes porous and contested rather than absolute. This prolonged stalemate favors the defenders holding interior lines. Time works against the Greeks far from their homeland, yet both sides commit to total victory regardless of cost. The Hittite Empire watches the Western War with growing concern. They send diplomatic protests to both Greeks and Luwian rebels. They demand respect for existing treaties and territorial boundaries. They threaten military intervention to restore regional order. But internal problems prevent the Hittites from decisive action. They fight simultaneous wars on their southern and eastern borders. They face succession disputes and administrative breakdown in their heartland. They cannot spare the army needed to relieve Wilusa. The vassal city must survive through its own efforts. Greek naval power gives them strategic advantages, despite the stalemate ashore. Their fleet controls the sea lanes surrounding Wilusa. They intercept supply ships attempting to reach the city. They raid coastal settlements throughout Luwian territory at will. They establish forward bases on offshore islands near Anatolia. This maritime dominance slowly strangles Luwian commerce and communication. Cities throughout the Confederation feel economic pressure mounting. Trade collapses as merchants avoid the dangerous waters. The war's economic consequences spread far beyond the battlefield. Year 3 of the siege brings the conflict to a new level of brutality. Both sides abandon any pretense of civilized warfare. The Greeks massacre civilians in captured Luwian towns. They enslave populations and burn settlements to the ground. The Luwians retaliate by torturing Greek prisoners publicly. They desecrate the bodies of fallen enemy warriors. Religious sanctuaries that should be neutral ground become military targets. Sacred truces traditionally observed for festivals are violated routinely. The war consumes any remaining moral restraint on both sides. New Greek allies join the expedition as it continues. Lesser kingdoms smell opportunity in the chaos created. They contribute small contingents, hoping to share eventual plunder. Mercenary bands arrive seeking employment and adventure. The Greek camp swells with warriors from across the Mediterranean. This influx of forces allows the Greeks to intensify operations. They can now maintain pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously. They raid deeper into Luwian territory with larger forces. The psychological toll on Wilusa's defenders grows unbearable over time. They have endured years of siege without relief or respite. Food stores dwindle despite rationing and smuggled supplies. Disease spreads through the crowded city under unsanitary conditions. Families bury loved ones inside the walls as casualties accumulate. Children grow up knowing only war and deprivation, yet the population refuses to surrender to the invaders. They remember massacres in other Luwian cities that resisted. Surrender offers no guarantee of mercy or survival. Diplomatic efforts to end the war fail repeatedly. Various parties attempt to broker negotiated settlements. The Hittites offer to mediate between Greeks and Luwians. Egyptian ambassadors propose compromises over disputed territories. Neutral trading cities send envoys advocating for peace, but the positions of both sides have hardened beyond compromise. The Greeks demand total surrender and enormous tribute. The Luwians refuse to yield their independence or wealth. Too much blood has been spilled for reconciliation. Too many warriors have died for their leaders to accept anything less than victory. Around 1243 BC, a controversial decision divides the Luwian Confederation. Some kingdoms argue for negotiating separate peace with the Greeks. They suggest abandoning Wilusa to preserve their own cities. They claim the war has already cost more than Wilusa's strategic value. This faction includes several coastal kingdoms suffering Greek naval raids. Other Luwian rulers denounce such proposals as betrayal and cowardice. They insist that abandoning Wilusa guarantees eventual Greek conquest of all. They demand continued resistance, regardless of sacrifice. The Confederation teeters on the edge of internal collapse. Hector's death in single combat shakes Luwian morale throughout the region. The prince falls to Achilles in a duel outside the city gates. Achilles drags the body behind his chariot in deliberate desecration. The sight breaks something inside Wilusa's defenders and population. Hector had embodied their hope for survival and victory. His death seems to foreshadow inevitable defeat for the city. Panic and despair spread through the Luwian ranks across all fronts. Allied kingdoms begin questioning whether continued resistance makes sense. The psychological balance of the war shifts dramatically, yet even this blow does not break the Luwian will to fight. New commanders step forward to replace fallen leaders. Paris, another of Priam's sons, takes increasing responsibility for the defense. Allied Luwian kingdoms send additional reinforcements despite their doubts. They recognize they are committed beyond any turning back. The Greeks grow frustrated at the defenders' stubborn refusal to yield. They expected Hector's death to trigger surrender negotiations. Instead, the siege continues into its 8th year without resolution. The Greek coalition also suffers internal fractures as the war drags on. Achilles himself falls to a Luwian arrow in confused fighting. His death removes the Greeks' most formidable warrior from the field. Other Greek champions die in the grinding attrition of daily combat. Agamemnon's authority erodes as casualties mount without decisive victory. Some Greek contingents quietly abandon the expedition and sail home. The coalition that seemed invincible at the war's start weakens year by year. Both sides are bleeding themselves toward mutual destruction. Across the Mediterranean, other powers observe the Western war with mounting alarm. The conflict consumes resources that previously flowed through international trade. Bronze production declines as copper and tin shipments are disrupted. Food supplies destabilize as agricultural regions become battlefields. Merchant ships avoid the war zone entirely, severing commercial connections. The interconnected Bronze Age economy begins to unravel from the edges. Refugees from devastated Luwian territories stream southward and eastward. They carry stories of atrocities and apocalyptic destruction. By 1240 BC, the war has fundamentally transformed the region. Western Anatolia lies devastated from years of raids and battles. Once prosperous cities stand burned and depopulated throughout Luwian territory. Agricultural production has collapsed across entire districts. The sophisticated trade networks that enriched the region are shattered. An entire generation of warriors has been killed or maimed. The social fabric holding Bronze Age civilization together is tearing, yet neither side can afford to lose or compromise. The strategic stakes and accumulated blood cost demand victory. Unknown to either side, their war is about to trigger consequences across the entire Mediterranean. The strains they have created will not remain localized in Anatolia. The economic disruption will cascade through interconnected kingdoms and empires. The refugees will carry instability to previously stable regions. The warriors who survive will seek new opportunities in the coming chaos. And the Bronze Age world, balanced precariously at its height, will begin its catastrophic fall. As the 8th year of siege approaches its climax, no one could predict. As the 8th year of siege approaches its climax, Greek commanders devise a desperate stratagem. They build an enormous wooden horse as a supposed offering to the god. The structure towers over 30 feet high and rides on concealed wheels. Greek warriors hide inside the hollow belly in complete darkness. The main Greek army pretends to abandon the siege and sail away. Their black ships disappear beyond the horizon toward the west. Only the wooden horse remains on the beach outside Wilusa's gates. Luwian scouts report the Greek departure with cautious celebration. Citizens peer from the walls at the empty Greek camps. Smoke still rises from campfires abandoned hours before. The wooden horse stands alone on the beach like a monument. Debate erupts within Wilusa about what the strange structure means. Some argue it is a sacred offering the Greeks left behind. Others suspect a trap and urge caution before investigating. Priests are consulted about the religious significance of the horse. Political factions within the city argue different interpretations and responses. Against wise counsel, the gates of Wilusa open for the first time in years. Warriors venture onto the plain cautiously with weapons ready. They approach the wooden horse, expecting ambush from all sides. But no Greek forces materialize from hiding or from the abandoned camps. The structure appears to be exactly what it seems, a large wooden horse. Ropes are attached to drag it toward the city as a war trophy. The population gathers to witness this symbol of apparent Greek defeat. A massive effort begins to drag the horse through the gates. The structure barely fits through the widest entrance to the city. That night, Wilusa celebrates its apparent survival with wine and feasting. Warriors who have fought for 8 years finally relax their vigilance. Women dance in the streets that have known only fear and grief. Children play games outside for the first time in their memories. The population allows itself to believe the nightmare has ended. The Greeks have given up and sailed home in defeat. Wilusa has survived through courage, endurance, and divine favor. The city's triumph will be remembered across the Luwian world. But in the darkness, warriors emerge from the wooden horse's belly. They move through the sleeping city with bronze weapons drawn. They signal to Greek forces waiting offshore in the concealed fleet. The ships return under cover of darkness, and land forces quickly. Warriors who left that morning return that night with murder in their hearts. The gates of Wilusa open from inside by Greek infiltrators, Thousands of Greek warriors pour into the unprepared city. The slaughter begins before most defenders realize what is happening. Wilusa burns as Greek warriors enact vengeance for 8 years of frustration. They massacre the population indiscriminately in the streets and houses. King Priam dies defending his palace to the last moment. The royal family is killed or enslaved without mercy. Temples are looted and burned despite their sacred status. Women and children are dragged away as slaves and prizes. The defenders who fought so courageously are cut down in their beds. Buildings that stood for centuries collapse in flames that night. By dawn, Wilusa has ceased to exist as a living city. The archaeological evidence confirms this catastrophic destruction in vivid detail. Excavations at Troy, Sevena reveal a destruction layer thick with ash and debris. Human remains lie scattered through the ruins in violent positions. Valuable items are abandoned in the chaos of flight and death. The stratigraphy shows the city burned and collapsed in a single catastrophic event. Dating evidence places this destruction around 1200 to 1180 BC. The scale of devastation matches ancient descriptions of total warfare. Everything in the city was consumed by fire and violence. The survivors, if any, never rebuilt on the same scale. News of Wilusa's fall spreads across Anatolia like wildfire. Luwian kingdoms realize their worst fears have materialized. The strongest fortress in their confederation has been destroyed. The strategic Dardanelles now lies open to Greek control. Greek naval forces can operate throughout the region without opposition. The balance of power in Western Anatolia has shifted decisively. Refugees from Wilusa arrive in allied cities with horrific stories. They describe massacres, enslavement, and total destruction. The psychological impact on the Luwian Confederation is devastating. The Greek coalition does not rest after Wilusa's conquest. They move immediately to exploit their advantage throughout the region. Greek forces attack other Luwian cities along the coast. They aim to destroy Luwian power permanently before opposition can organize. City after city falls to Greek assault in rapid succession. Some surrender without resistance, hoping to avoid Wilusa's fate. Others fight desperately, but lack the fortifications to withstand Greek siegecraft. The entire Luwian Confederation faces existential crisis within months. The civilization that dominated Western Anatolia for centuries is collapsing. The sack of cities follows a consistent pattern of horrific brutality. The Greeks have learned that terror facilitates faster conquests. Populations are massacred regardless of resistance or surrender. Buildings are burned systematically to deny resources to the enemy. Agricultural land is devastated to create famine and depopulation. Religious sites are desecrated to break spiritual resistance. Survivors are enslaved and shipped to Greece as chattel. The Greeks are not conquering to rule Luwian territory. They are annihilating it to remove a commercial and military rival. The destruction goes beyond strategic necessity into genocide. Luwian kingdoms attempt to coordinate resistance, but their alliance is fracturing. Some kingdoms sue for peace with the Greeks individually. They offer tribute, hostages, and submission to avoid destruction. Others flee inland away from the vulnerable coast. They abandon their cities and territories to save their populations. A few kingdoms fight to the death despite hopeless odds. These scattered responses allow Greeks to defeat them piecemeal. The confederation that might have repelled the Greeks through unity is broken. Internal divisions that emerged during the siege now prove fatal. The Hittite Empire finally mobilizes to intervene in the Western disaster. Hittite armies march west from their central Anatolia heartland. They intend to restore order and their vassals to power. They cannot allow Greeks to establish permanent control of Anatolia's west coast. But the Hittite response comes far too late to save the Luwians. Most of the cities have already fallen by the time help arrives. The Hittites find devastated countryside and refugee streams instead of functioning kingdoms. Their military expedition becomes a humanitarian rescue operation instead of combat. Greek and Hittite forces nearly clash in several confused encounters. Both sides probe each other's strength and intentions without full engagement. The Greeks recognize they cannot defeat the Hittite Empire directly. The Hittites realize the Greeks can retreat to their fleet at any time. An uneasy standoff develops, with neither side willing to escalate further. Diplomatic exchanges replace military confrontation as both sides seek advantage. The Greeks agree to withdraw from most Luwian territory they have conquered. The Hittites accept Greek control of the strategic coastal positions. An exhausted compromise emerges from mutual weakness rather than strength, but the damage to the Luwian civilization is catastrophic and permanent. The major cities lie in ruins throughout western Anatolia. The population is killed, enslaved, or displaced across the region. The sophisticated trade networks are destroyed beyond restoration. The political structures holding kingdoms together have collapsed entirely. The cultural institutions preserving Luwian identity are shattered. An entire civilization has been effectively erased from the map. The Greeks have achieved their strategic objective of eliminating a major competitor, but the cost of this victory will prove greater than anyone imagined. The refugees from devastated Luwian territories become a destabilizing force across the Mediterranean. Tens of thousands flee their destroyed cities seeking new homes. They travel in armed bands for protection and resources. They attack other settlements to acquire food and supplies. They are desperate people with nothing to lose and everything to gain. Their skills as warriors and sailors make them formidable threats. They know sophisticated military tactics and Bronze Age technology. They have learned ruthless warfare from the Greeks who destroyed their civilization. Now they will apply these lessons throughout the Mediterranean world. Within a few years, the refugee crisis transforms into something more sinister. The displaced Luwians coalesce into organized military groups. They acquire ships through piracy, purchase, and construction. They raid coastal settlements from Anatolia to Syria to Egypt. They are no longer refugees seeking asylum, but warriors seeking revenge. They target the prosperous kingdoms that did nothing to help the Luwians. They aim to acquire wealth through conquest, like the Greeks did. They have become the sea peoples whose invasions will terrorize the Bronze Age world. The chain of consequences set in motion at Wilusa cannot be stopped now. The Greek victory has destabilized the entire Eastern Mediterranean economic system. The Luwian destruction has created a warrior migration spreading chaos. The Hittite intervention has weakened their empire at a critical moment. Other kingdoms throughout the region face internal pressures they cannot manage. The sophisticated, interdependent civilization of the Bronze Age is collapsing. No one understands yet that an entire age is ending. They think this is just another war with winners and losers. But even as the siege of Wilusa finally ends, a greater catastrophe approaches. Even as the siege of Wilusa finally ends, a greater catastrophe approaches across the entire Mediterranean. The displaced Luwian warriors begin organizing into confederations with ships and weapons. They are not seeking new homes to settle peacefully. They are planning revenge and plunder on a massive scale. Within months, the first raids strike unprepared coastal cities. The attacks are swift, brutal, and coordinated with military precision. Settlements burn as populations flee inland in panic. The age of the sea peoples has begun. Across the Aegean, the victorious Greek kingdoms face unexpected collapse. The warriors return home after 8 years to find their kingdoms changed. Populations have declined from disease, famine, and economic disruption. Agricultural production has fallen without enough workers during the war. Trade networks that sustained Greek prosperity are broken from the conflict. Political rivals have consolidated power in the warriors' long absence. The homecoming becomes crisis rather than celebration for many Greek heroes. Mycenae itself, the leading Greek kingdom, faces internal instability immediately. Agamemnon returns to find his wife has taken a lover. She murders him in his bath shortly after his arrival home. His son seeks revenge, triggering a cycle of family violence. This pattern repeats across Greek kingdoms throughout the Peloponnese. The warrior class that won the Trojan War cannot restore order at home. Political murders, succession disputes, and civil conflicts erupt everywhere. The social bonds maintaining Greek civilization are dissolving from internal pressure. The economic consequences of the Luwian destruction cascade throughout the Mediterranean system. The Luwian kingdoms were critical intermediaries in international trade. They controlled copper sources in Anatolia, essential for bronze production. They managed overland trade routes from Mesopotamia to the Aegean. Their merchants facilitated exchanges between East and West Mediterranean. With the Luwians destroyed, these vital economic functions cease. Kingdoms throughout the region cannot acquire the resources they need. Bronze production declines as raw materials become scarce. The entire Bronze Age economy begins to fail. The Hittite Empire hemorrhages territory and authority throughout its western provinces. The disastrous intervention in the Luwian collapse drains military resources. Border defenses weaken as the best troops deploy westward. Enemy kingdoms on other frontiers sense opportunity in Hittite weakness. The empire faces simultaneous crises on southern, eastern, and northern borders. Internal political disputes paralyze the central government in Hattusa. Provincial governors begin acting independently without royal authority. The greatest Near Eastern empire is disintegrating from multiple pressures. A severe drought strikes across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC. Rainfall patterns shift dramatically from historical norms for several consecutive years. Rivers that sustained irrigation agriculture for centuries run dangerously low. Wells dry up as water tables drop below accessible depths. Crops fail across entire regions simultaneously for the first time. Kingdoms that stored surplus grain for emergencies exhaust their reserves. Famine spreads through populations already stressed by war and economic disruption. The environmental catastrophe compounds all the human-created problems. The Egyptian empire watches developments to its north with growing alarm. Egypt has remained aloof from the Anatolian wars until now. Egyptian pharaohs focused on their traditional southern and eastern interests. They maintained the wealth and stability others have lost. But refugees begin appearing along Egypt's northern coast and borders. Ships carrying armed warriors approach Egyptian harbors without permission. Egyptian coastal settlements report attacks by mysterious sea raiders. The chaos consuming the rest of the Mediterranean has reached Egypt's doorstep. Pharaoh Merneptah faces the first serious invasion threat in centuries. Armed confederations of sea peoples mass along Egypt's western border. They are allied with Libyan tribes seeking to plunder Egyptian wealth. Egyptian intelligence identifies the invaders by their regional origins and names. The reports mention Peliset, Shekelesh, Luka, and other groups. The Luka are almost certainly displaced Luwians seeking revenge and plunder. They have traveled from devastated Anatolia to attack Egyptian prosperity. The coalition assembles the largest invasion force Egypt has faced in generations. The Battle of Pyrrhic in 1208 BC determines Egypt's fate. Merneptah leads Egyptian forces against the Sea People's coalition personally. The battle rages for an entire day across the desert frontier. Egyptian archers and chariots face desperate warriors with nothing to lose. The Sea Peoples fight with ferocity, born of displacement and hunger. They employ tactics learned from Greek siege warfare in Anatolia. But Egyptian discipline and organization prove superior in open battle. The invaders are slaughtered by the thousands on the battlefield. Merneptah claims to have killed over 6,000 enemy warriors. The Egyptian victory saves the kingdom from invasion and collapse. But Egypt's triumph is only temporary and comes at terrible cost. The battle depletes Egyptian military strength and financial reserves significantly. The kingdom cannot sustain this level of military mobilization indefinitely. More concerning, the defeated sea peoples do not disappear after their loss. They retreat and regroup elsewhere along the Mediterranean coast. Within years, they will return in even greater numbers. Egypt has won a battle, but the larger war continues. The respite allows Egypt to prepare, but not to eliminate the threat. Meanwhile, Cyprus suffers catastrophic destruction from coordinated sea peoples' attacks. The island's copper production makes it a valuable target for raiders. Cities like Nkomi and Kition burn in systematic destruction campaigns. Archaeological evidence shows violent demolition layers across multiple Cypriot sites. The attackers are not interested in conquest or occupation. They destroy the infrastructure of copper production deliberately and thoroughly. They want to deny this critical resource to their enemies. The loss of Cypriot copper accelerates the Mediterranean bronze shortage. The entire Bronze Age technological foundation is crumbling. The Hittite capital, Hattusa, falls to unknown attackers around 1190 BC. The city is systematically destroyed in a catastrophic conflagration. The royal palace complex burns so intensely that mud bricks vitrify from heat. The administrative archives are destroyed, eliminating government records forever. The population flees or is killed with no organized evacuation. The empire that dominated Anatolia for 4 centuries ceases to exist overnight. Scholars debate who destroyed Hattusa and why even today. The most likely culprits are the displaced Luwian warriors seeking revenge. The Hittites abandoned the Luwians during their moment of crisis. Now the Luwians have destroyed the Hittite heartland in retribution. Ugarit, a wealthy Canaanite port city, becomes the next major victim. The city dominated maritime trade along the Levantine coast for centuries. Its merchant fleet connected Egypt, Cyprus, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia commercially. Its archives preserved diplomatic correspondence, treaties, and trading records. Around 1185 BC, sea peoples attacked the city from the sea. The last letters from Ugarit's king plead desperately for help. He writes that enemy ships are visible offshore in overwhelming numbers. He begs allies to send immediate military assistance. No help arrives before the city falls to the invaders. The destruction of Ugarit is thorough and permanent. The attackers burn the city systematically, building by building. The royal palace collapses into ruins, burying priceless archives. The harbor installations are demolished to prevent future use. The population is killed or enslaved with typical sea people's brutality. The city is never rebuilt or reoccupied after this catastrophic event. Archaeologists excavating the site find the destruction layers undisturbed. The letters pleading for help lie where they fell 3,000 years ago. Ugarit's fall eliminates another critical node in the Mediterranean trade network. Along the Levantine coast, dozens of smaller cities suffer identical fates. Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, and many others face sea people's attacks. Some cities survive through desperate defensive efforts and luck. Others fall to the sustained assault campaigns despite fortifications. The entire eastern Mediterranean coastline becomes a war zone. Maritime trade that sustained Bronze Age civilization for centuries effectively ceases. Ships dare not venture into waters patrolled by sea people's raiders. The sophisticated, interconnected economy disintegrates into isolated local economies. Kingdoms that depended on imports of food or resources face collapse. In Greece, the Mycenaean palace centers fall one by one to internal or external threats. Pylos burns around 1180 BC in circumstances that remain mysterious. Thebes is destroyed and never recovers its former glory. Mycenae itself is attacked multiple times and eventually abandoned. The Linear B tablets that recorded palace administration are preserved accidentally by fire. These tablets provide a snapshot of the collapse as it happened. They record frantic defensive preparations, resource shortages, and communication breakdowns. The palace scribes document a civilization dying in real time. Then the writing stops forever as the palaces burn. The collapse spreads beyond the Mediterranean to distant regions through trade networks. Mesopotamian kingdoms suffer from the disruption of Anatolian trade routes. Arabian trade networks collapse as Mediterranean demand disappears. Even distant kingdoms in Central Europe feel effects through broken amber trade. The Bronze Age globalized economy was more interconnected than anyone realized. The failure of one region cascades through the entire system. No kingdom can remain isolated from the spreading catastrophe. The world is discovering how fragile their prosperity really was. By 1175 BC, the entire Eastern Mediterranean world has fundamentally transformed. The great palace civilizations are destroyed or critically weakened everywhere. The Hittite Empire is gone from history completely. Mycenaean Greece has fragmented into poverty and illiteracy. The Luwian kingdoms exist only as ruins and refugee populations. Egypt survives, but faces repeated invasions, draining its strength. Trade networks that connected 3 continents are severed. Bronze production declines precipitously from shortages of copper and tin. Writing systems disappear as the literate classes are killed or displaced. An entire civilization is collapsing into a dark age. The population of the Mediterranean region falls by perhaps 50% within decades. Disease, famine, warfare, and migration all contribute to the demographic catastrophe. Cities that housed tens of thousands are abandoned to a few hundred survivors. Agricultural production collapses without organized labor and irrigation systems. Entire regions revert to subsistence farming and pastoralism from urban civilization. Knowledge accumulated over centuries is lost as educational systems fail. Technologies like ironworking almost disappear before later rediscovery. The human cost is incalculable in suffering and lost potential. The displaced populations create a chain reaction of further migrations and conflicts. Groups fleeing destroyed regions invade their neighbors, seeking new lands. These invasions trigger further displacement in an expanding wave. The Philistines settle in Canaan after wandering from their original homes. The Dorians invade Greece from the north, filling power vacuums. Aramean tribes spread across Syria and Mesopotamia from Arabian deserts. Each migration creates new conflicts and further instability. The population movements continue for over a century after the initial collapse. The entire ethnic and political map of the Mediterranean is redrawn. While Wilusa burned and Luwian cities fell, across the continent, civilizations watched their own destruction approach. The Mycenaean palaces recorded their final desperate days on clay tablets. The Hittite scribes fled their burning capital, carrying what records they could. The Egyptian priests carved warnings about the sea peoples on temple walls. And somewhere in the chaos, Luwian survivors plotted revenge against everyone who abandoned them. But even as Egypt fought off the first invasion, the sea peoples prepared for a second larger assault. In 1177 BC, the largest invasion force yet assembled would strike Egypt's heartland. The pharaoh Ramesses III would face the ultimate test of Egyptian power, and the outcome would determine whether any Bronze Age civilization survived at all. In 1177 BC, the largest invasion force yet assembled strikes Egypt's heartland with overwhelming numbers. The Sea Peoples have spent years organizing and gathering strength for this assault. They approach Egypt from 2 directions simultaneously in a coordinated strategy. A massive fleet attacks from the sea along the Nile Delta coast. A massive land army advances overland through Canaan toward Egypt's border. The 2 forces plan to converge on Egypt's economic heart. The invasion represents the accumulated fury of the entire Bronze Age collapse. If Egypt falls, no Bronze Age civilization will survive the catastrophe. Rameses III has prepared for this moment since taking the throne. He learned from Merneptah's earlier victory and its limitations. He strengthened Egypt's military with new weapons, tactics, and fortifications. He stockpiled grain reserves to sustain a long defensive campaign. He fortified the Nile Delta against naval assault with bases and fortresses. He recruited mercenaries to supplement Egyptian forces with fresh troops. The preparations consumed enormous resources over several years. But now those investments face their ultimate test against impossible odds. The Sea Peoples Coalition includes groups from across the collapsed Mediterranean world. The Peliset will later be known as Philistines in biblical tradition. The Cheka, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh join the invasion force. The Luka, those displaced Luwians, provide experienced warriors and leadership. Each group brings warriors hardened by years of wandering and warfare. Together, they field perhaps 100,000 warriors and their families. This is not just a military expedition, but an entire migration. The Sea Peoples are looking for new lands to settle permanently. They have decided Egypt will be those lands, regardless of Egyptian resistance. The naval battle unfolds in the Nile Delta with unprecedented ferocity. Hundreds of Sea Peoples ships attack Egyptian positions along the coast. The invaders use ships captured or built during years of piracy. Their naval tactics reflect experience raiding throughout the Mediterranean. But Rameses has prepared specifically for this naval threat. Egyptian archers line the riverbanks and harbor walls in dense formations. Egyptian ships engage the invaders in close combat on the water. The battle becomes a massacre as Egyptian arrows slaughter Sea Peoples warriors. The invaders are trapped in narrow waterways without room to maneuver. Their ships burn and sink under sustained Egyptian fire. Bodies choke the Nile Delta as the naval invasion fails catastrophically. Simultaneously, the land battle rages in the eastern desert approaches. The Sea Peoples' land army advances confidently, expecting Egyptian weakness. They bring ox carts carrying their families and possessions with them. Women, children, and elders accompany the warriors to the new lands. This demographic detail proves their intention to settle Egypt permanently. But they march into a carefully prepared defensive position. Rameses has chosen the battlefield to maximize Egyptian advantages. Egyptian chariots and archers attack from optimal positions with clear fields of fire. The invaders fight desperately but cannot break the Egyptian formations. The battle turns into slaughter as organized defense defeats desperate assault. The decisive day of battle determines the fate of Bronze Age civilization. Rameses III personally leads his forces with his son at his side. The pharaoh's presence inspires Egyptian warriors to extraordinary courage and discipline. The battle rages from dawn until sunset without pause or respite. The Sea Peoples throw wave after wave of warriors against Egyptian lines. Egyptian discipline holds despite casualties and exhaustion mounting on both sides. As darkness falls, the Sea Peoples' army breaks and retreats in disorder. Thousands of invaders lie dead on the battlefield. The survivors flee eastward, carrying news of the catastrophic defeat. Egypt has survived the greatest threat in its 3,000-year history. Rameses III records his victory on temple walls at Medinet Habu. The reliefs show Egyptian forces destroying Sea Peoples' ships and warriors. Hieroglyphic inscriptions boast of the pharaoh's military genius and divine favor. The texts list the names of defeated enemy peoples with pride. The inscriptions describe piles of enemy dead and captured prisoners. The archaeological and historical evidence confirms the victory's scale. Egypt genuinely defeated an existential threat through superior preparation and fighting. But the victory comes at enormous cost that Egypt can barely afford. The aftermath reveals Egypt's pyrrhic victory over the Sea Peoples' invasion. The military effort bankrupts the Egyptian treasury despite success. The cost of mobilization, fortification, and sustained warfare is staggering. Egypt must pay its mercenary troops and reward loyal Egyptian warriors. The kingdom must rebuild damaged fortifications and military installations. Agricultural production has suffered from warfare and labor demands. Trade networks remain broken throughout the Mediterranean world. Egypt has won survival, but at the price of its imperial power. Never again will Egypt dominate the Near East as it once did. The defeated Sea Peoples do not disappear after their failed invasion. Many prisoners are incorporated into Egyptian military service as mercenaries. Others are settled in Egyptian-controlled territories in Canaan as garrison troops. The Pelisets settle in the coastal plain that becomes Philistia. The Cheka establish themselves in settlements along the Levantine coast. These defeated invaders become permanent features of the regional politics. They adapt to new circumstances rather than accepting total defeat. Their descendants will shape Near Eastern history for centuries. The Sea Peoples' migration has permanently altered the ethnic landscape, but the larger Bronze Age collapse continues despite Egypt's defensive success. Egypt cannot help other kingdoms because it barely saved itself. The Hittite Empire remains destroyed with no possibility of restoration. Mycenaean Greece descends deeper into poverty and fragmentation. The Luwian civilization exists only as scattered refugee populations. The sophisticated trade networks never fully recover from the disruption. Bronze becomes increasingly scarce as copper and tin supplies dwindle. Ironworking begins to replace bronze working out of desperate necessity. The technological foundation of an entire age is shifting underneath everyone. The palace economies that organize Bronze Age civilization cannot adapt to the new conditions. These systems depended on centralized control of resources and labor. They required literacy, bureaucracy, and international trade to function. The collapse has eliminated or severely damaged all these prerequisites. Palace scribes are killed, enslaved, or become refugees themselves. The administrative archives are burned in destroyed cities. The international trade that supplied materials is severed. Without these supports, the palace systems simply cease to function. What replaces them is much simpler and poorer. The archaeological evidence shows how thoroughly civilization declined after 1177 BC. Settlement sizes shrink dramatically throughout the former palace territories. Monumental architecture ceases as organizational capacity disappears. Pottery becomes cruder and less diverse than before the collapse. Long-distance trade goods vanish from excavated contexts. Burials become simpler without elaborate grave goods. Writing disappears entirely in Greece and survives minimally elsewhere. The material culture indicates societies reverting to much simpler organization. People are struggling to survive rather than building civilizations. The collapse creates a dark age lasting over 3 centuries in some regions. Greece descends into illiteracy and poverty until about 800 BC. Writing disappears until the Greeks adapt the Phoenician alphabet later. Population levels remain low compared to the Bronze Age peak. The palace centers are never rebuilt to their former glory. Cultural memory of the Bronze Age survives only in garbled oral traditions. The Linear B script is forgotten completely until modern archaeological rediscovery. An entire civilization has been erased from living memory. Only ruins and legends remain to mark what was lost. Yet knowledge of the Luwians disappears more completely than any other civilization. The Hittites are remembered through biblical references and Egyptian records. The Mycenaeans survive in Homer's epics, however distorted by time. The Egyptians maintain continuous civilization and historical memory, but the Luwians vanish almost entirely from historical consciousness. Their cities lie buried under Turkish villages and farmland. Their hieroglyphic inscriptions weather away on remote mountain faces. Their language survives only in a few tablets and seals. For 3,000 years, historians do not even know they existed. The civilization that may have triggered the entire collapse becomes its most forgotten victim. In the ruins of Wilusa, wind blows through empty streets. The wooden horse is long since burned for firewood or rotted away. The walls stand broken where Greeks breached them decades ago. No one rebuilds the city that dominated the Dardanelles for centuries. Occasional travelers pass through the ruins, wondering what happened here. Local people tell stories of ancient kings and great wars, but they do not remember the Luwians who built these walls. They do not know this was Wilusa before Greeks called it Troy. The truth lies buried under ash and collapsed stonework, and there it will remain for 3,000 years until modern archaeology begins uncovering the evidence. But in a palace archive in Hattusa, one seal remains pressed into clay. One seal remains pressed into clay tablets and waits for discovery. The Alexandru Treaty between the Hittite king and Wilusa's ruler survives the city's destruction. The text describes Wilusa as a Luwian-speaking Hittite vassal state. It mentions the king's Luwian name and his diplomatic obligations. The treaty confirms what Homer called Troy was actually Luwian Wilusa. This single document will eventually revolutionize our understanding of Bronze Age Anatolia. But first, it must survive 3,000 years buried under ruins, and then it must be found by archaeologists who can read it. That discovery will not happen until the 20th century arrives with new methods. The 19th century brings romantic adventurers to the ruins of ancient Troy. Heinrich Schliemann excavates the site beginning in 1870 with crude methods. He seeks Homer's Troy and claims to find it in layers of destruction. His discoveries capture public imagination across Europe and America. The treasures he uncovers seem to validate Homer's epic poetry, but Schliemann cannot read the Luwian inscriptions he actually finds. He does not understand the culture that built the city. He interprets everything through the lens of Greek literature. The true identity of Troy's builders remains hidden despite excavation. The Luwians stay lost even as their capital is uncovered. The early 20th century brings systematic archaeology to Anatolian sites. Excavations at Hattusa begin in 1906 under German direction. Archaeologists discover thousands of clay tablets in Hittite archives. The tablets record diplomatic correspondence, treaties, and administrative documents. Scholars begin deciphering the Hittite cuneiform script using comparative linguistics. The decipherment reveals references to places, people, and kingdoms unknown from other sources. Western Anatolia appears in the texts under various kingdom names. The Arzawa lands, Mira, Seha River, Hapala, and Wilusa all appear regularly. But scholars do not immediately understand these are all Luwian kingdoms. The Alexandru Treaty emerges from the Hattusa archives in the early 20th century. Scholars translate the Hittite text describing relations with Wilusa slowly. The treaty mentions geographical details that seem to match Troy's location. It describes the Seha River kingdom to the north of Wilusa. It places Wilusa near the Aegean coast with access to sea routes. The linguistic connection between Wilusa and Ilios becomes increasingly clear. Wilusa is the Hittite name for Homer's Troy, confirmed by treaty. But the treaty also reveals Wilusa's ruler spoke Luwian, not Greek. The city at the center of Greek legend was not Greek at all. Throughout the mid-20th century, Luwian studies advanced slowly but systematically. Scholars identify Luwian hieroglyphic inscriptions across hundreds of Anatolian sites. They discover the language was far more widespread than previously thought. Luwian appears in areas that were supposedly Hittite-controlled territories. The inscriptions suggest an entire civilization hidden beneath Hittite dominance. Gradually, scholars realized the Luwians were not a minor ethnic group. They were a major Bronze Age civilization controlling Western Anatolia. The recognition comes decades after excavations began uncovering their remains. New excavations at Troy in the 1980s and 1990s bring modern scientific methods. The team discovers evidence of extensive Bronze Age settlement beyond the citadel. Lower town discoveries expand Troy's estimated size to perhaps 15 times previous estimates. The city may have housed 10,000 people at its late Bronze Age peak. Fortifications protecting the lower town demonstrate sophisticated military planning. The scale suggests a major regional power, not a minor citadel. Everything about the site indicates political and economic importance. This matches Luwian Wilusa's role in Hittite diplomatic correspondence perfectly. In 1995, a critical discovery links Troy directly to the Luwian world, definitively. Excavators find a bronze seal in destruction layers from Troy 7A. The seal bears a Luwian hieroglyphic inscription identifying its owner. The text appears to be a personal name, written in authentic Luwian style. The seal confirms Luwian literacy and administration at Bronze Age Troy. It provides physical evidence linking the site to Luwian civilization. The connection between Wilusa and Troy is no longer theoretical, but archaeological fact. The city Homer immortalized was Luwian in language and culture. The Trojans were Luwians fighting for their civilization's survival. The implications revolutionize our understanding of the Trojan War and Bronze Age history. The conflict was not Greeks against Greeks, as some scholars suggested. It was not Greeks against Hittites directly either. It was Greeks against Luwians, two distinct Bronze Age civilizations competing for Mediterranean dominance. The war becomes an international conflict involving multiple kingdoms and cultures. The stakes included control of critical trade routes and strategic geography. The destruction of Troy represents the destruction of an entire culture. The legendary war takes on new meaning as civilizational conflict. Further research reveals the scope of Luwian civilization throughout Bronze Age Anatolia. Archaeological surveys identify hundreds of Luwian sites across western Turkey. Most remain unexcavated under modern settlements and agricultural land. Surface finds include pottery, inscriptions, and architectural remains spanning centuries. The settlement pattern suggests a complex civilization with urban centers and rural hinterlands. The distribution matches the Luwian kingdoms described in Hittite texts. Azawa, Mira, Seha River, and other kingdoms can be tentatively located. A lost Bronze Age civilization emerges from 3 millennia of historical obscurity. The Luwian language itself reveals a sophisticated literate culture with deep roots. Luwian belongs to the Anatolian branch of Indo-European languages. It shares distant ancestry with Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and most European languages. But Luwian diverged from other Indo-European languages several millennia before the Bronze Age. The language developed its own unique characteristics and vocabulary. Luwian speakers created their own hieroglyphic writing system distinct from other scripts. The script appears on seals, monuments, rock faces, and administrative documents. The language survived in various forms into the Iron Age after the Bronze Age collapse. Some scholars suggest Luwian influenced later languages including Lydian and Lycian. The connection between the Luwians and the Sea peoples becomes increasingly compelling. The Luka people mentioned in Egyptian records of Sea peoples' invasions bear a Luwian name. The Luka land appears in Hittite texts as a Luwian-speaking region in western Anatolia. The chronology matches perfectly. Luwian civilization collapses around 1200 BC. Sea peoples' invasions begin around 1200 BC across the Mediterranean. The Luka appear as prominent members of Sea peoples' coalitions attacking Egypt. The geographical origin and timing suggest the Luka are displaced Luwians. Other Sea peoples groups may also include refugees from devastated Luwian territories. The Luwian destruction directly contributed to the Bronze Age collapse, spreading. Modern archaeological techniques continue revealing Luwian sites throughout Turkey. Ground-penetrating radar identifies buried structures without excavation. Satellite imagery spots ancient settlements invisible from ground level. Systematic field surveys map artifact distributions across entire regions. Each new survey discovers more Luwian sites than previously known. The civilization's scale continues growing as exploration expands. Scholars estimate hundreds of Luwian sites remain completely unknown still. Most will never be excavated given limited resources and priorities, but their existence confirms a Bronze Age civilization rivaling better-known cultures. The rediscovery of the Luwians forces scholars to reconsider Bronze Age Mediterranean history fundamentally. The Luwians were not peripheral players, but central actors in major events. They controlled critical geography linking Anatolia, the Aegean, and the Near East. They participated in international diplomacy and trade networks spanning 3 continents. Their destruction contributed directly to the Bronze Age collapse's cascade. The sea peoples that terrorized Egypt and the Levant included displaced Luwians. The Trojan War, immortalized by Homer, was actually a Luwian defensive struggle. Every aspect of Bronze Age history must be reconsidered, with Luwian civilization included. The revision continues as new evidence emerges from ongoing excavations. Yet despite these discoveries, the Luwians remain largely unknown to general audiences. Most people have never heard of them, despite their historical importance. The Hittites, Mycenaeans, and Egyptians dominate popular understanding of the Bronze Age. Troy is famous, but its Luwian identity remains obscure outside specialists. The civilization that may have triggered civilization's greatest collapse remains forgotten. The irony is profound. The Luwians shaped Mediterranean history decisively. Their destruction changed the course of Western civilization permanently, yet 3,000 years later, they remain historical ghosts barely remembered. But perhaps that is finally changing as the evidence accumulates. Perhaps the Luwians are emerging from the shadows at last. Their story demands recognition alongside other Bronze Age civilizations. But victory came at a price no one had imagined beyond mere recognition. For forgotten civilizations. The Bronze Age collapse that destroyed the Luwians transformed the Mediterranean world forever and permanently. The sophisticated palace economies never fully recovered from the catastrophic disruption they suffered. The international trade networks remained severed for centuries after the collapse spread. The technological knowledge of bronze working declined as copper and tin became scarce. Literacy disappeared in Greece and declined dramatically elsewhere throughout the region. Population levels fell by perhaps half across the entire Mediterranean world. The recovery took centuries and produced fundamentally different societies than before. The world that emerged from the collapse barely remembered what was lost. In the immediate aftermath, survivors struggled to comprehend what had happened to them. The palace centers lay in ruins without possibility of restoration or rebuilding. The kings and administrators who organized society were dead or displaced. The scribes who maintained records and knowledge were killed or scattered. The merchants who connected distant kingdoms no longer traveled the dangerous seas. The craftsmen who produced specialized goods lacked materials and customers simultaneously. Every aspect of the complex Bronze Age civilization had collapsed completely. People reverted to subsistence agriculture and local self-sufficiency from international specialization. They formed smaller communities based on kinship rather than centralized palace organization. The Luwian survivors scattered across the Mediterranean seeking new homes and livelihoods. Some settled in coastal Levant as the Luca among the sea peoples. Others integrated into neighboring Anatolian populations, losing their distinct identity gradually. Some may have reached distant western Mediterranean regions as refugees and colonists. Their language survived in fragmented form in later Anatolian dialects and inscriptions, but Luwian civilization as a unified culture effectively ended with the collapse. The kingdoms, cities, and political structures never revived in recognizable form. The hieroglyphic writing system fell out of use within centuries. By the Iron Age, the Luwians existed only as dim memories. Later, Greek and Roman historians did not even recognize them as distinct. The Greek world descended into what scholars call the Greek Dark Age. The Mycenaean palaces were never rebuilt after their destruction or abandonment. Linear B writing disappeared completely with the palace scribes who used it. Population declined dramatically, with many sites completely abandoned for centuries. The material culture became much simpler than the Bronze Age standard. Long-distance trade nearly ceased with only minimal contact maintained. Greece fragmented into small, isolated communities, competing for limited resources. Cultural memory of the Bronze Age survived only through oral poetry. The epics of Homer preserved garbled memories of the lost civilization, but the Greeks themselves did not understand their own past accurately. Yet from this catastrophic collapse emerged the foundation of classical Greek civilization eventually. The Dark Age forced Greeks to develop new social and political organizations. They created the polis, the independent city-state that defined Greek political culture. They adapted the Phoenician alphabet, creating the first true alphabetic writing system. They developed new technologies, including superior ironworking, that replaced lost bronze metallurgy. They expanded through colonization, establishing Greek settlements throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea. The classical Greece that produced philosophy, drama, and democracy grew from collapsed ruins. The Bronze Age catastrophe paradoxically enabled Greek civilization's greatest achievements later. The Hittite Empire vanished so completely that scholars doubted its existence until modern times. The capital, Hattusa, lay abandoned and forgotten under Anatolian highlands for millennia. The cuneiform archives remained buried, protecting them from further destruction accidentally. Later kingdoms built on Hittite territory, without remembering their predecessors at all. The Hittites survived only in biblical references that scholars once dismissed as legend. The rediscovery of Hattusa in the early 20th century astonished the academic world. Here was an entire empire lost to history despite its former power. The Hittite example showed how completely civilizations could disappear from human memory. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse, but never fully recovered its imperial power. The kingdom exhausted its resources, repelling multiple sea peoples' invasions successfully. The economy never regained the prosperity of the late Bronze Age peak. Egypt fragmented into competing power centers during subsequent centuries of weakness. Foreign dynasties eventually ruled Egypt as native power declined irreversibly. The New Kingdom imperial age ended with the Bronze Age collapse. Egypt's survival meant Bronze Age civilization did not completely disappear everywhere. But the Egypt that survived was fundamentally weaker than before the catastrophe. The Sea Peoples themselves eventually settled into new territories and identities across the region. The Philistines established kingdoms in Canaan, becoming Israel's biblical antagonists later. The Cheka and other groups settled along the Levantine coast, forming new cities. The Shekelesh may have reached Sicily, giving the island its eventual name. These displaced Bronze Age refugees became the ancestors of later Mediterranean populations. Their wanderings redistributed people and cultures across the entire region permanently. The ethnic and linguistic map of the Mediterranean was redrawn through their migrations. They carried technologies, ideas, and cultural practices to new regions during their travels. The Bronze Age collapse demonstrates how interconnected civilizations create systemic vulnerabilities and weaknesses. The Mediterranean world was globalized to a degree not matched again for millennia. Kingdoms depended on long-distance trade for essential resources like copper and tin. Political stability in one region affected economic prosperity in distant regions. The palace economies required centralized control that proved fragile under pressure. When one part of the system failed, the failure cascaded throughout the network. The collapse spread not because every region faced identical problems simultaneously. It spread because the regions were connected in ways that transmitted disruption. The lesson remains relevant for our equally interconnected modern world today. Climate change played a significant but debated role in the Bronze Age collapse. The drought beginning around 1200 BC stressed agricultural production across the Mediterranean region. Societies already weakened by warfare and economic disruption could not withstand environmental shock. Famine triggered migrations that destabilized neighboring regions in chain reactions. But climate was not the sole cause of the collapse, clearly. Human decisions, warfare, and political failures all contributed critically to the catastrophe. The collapse resulted from multiple factors, reinforcing each other in devastating combinations. Environmental stress, military conflict, economic disruption, and political breakdown all played roles. Modern scholars debate the relative importance of these factors continuously without consensus. The rediscovery of the Luwians changes how we understand the collapse's origins fundamentally. The Greek attack on Wilusa was not just legendary war, but historical event. The destruction of Luwian civilization created the refugee crisis that became the Sea Peoples. The Luwian displacement triggered the chain of invasions and migrations across the Mediterranean. If the Greeks had not destroyed the Luwian kingdoms so thoroughly and systematically, if the Hittites had protected their Luwian vassals more effectively against Greek expansion, if international diplomacy had prevented the escalation into total warfare initially, the Bronze Age collapse might have been avoided or at least substantially mitigated. The Luwian destruction appears central to the catastrophe's initial spark and spread. The archaeological evidence for this interpretation continues accumulating from ongoing excavations across Turkey. New Luwian sites reveal a civilization more extensive than previously imagined by scholars. The destruction layers date consistently to the early 12th century BC period. The chronology matches the collapse sequence perfectly across multiple independent excavation sites. The hieroglyphic inscriptions confirm cultural unity across widely distributed kingdoms before destruction. The pottery and architectural evidence shows sophisticated urban civilization before sudden abandonment. Every new discovery reinforces the picture of a major civilization destroyed catastrophically. The Luwians were not minor players, but central actors in Bronze Age history. Yet despite growing recognition among specialists, the Luwians remain obscure to general awareness. Most history textbooks do not mention them, except in specialized Bronze Age discussions. Popular documentaries focus on Egyptians, Greeks, and Hittites without noting the Luwians. Troy is famous worldwide, but few know the city was Luwian culturally. The civilization that potentially triggered history's greatest collapse remains largely unknown beyond academia. This obscurity seems almost deliberately ironic, given their apparent historical importance. The culture that shaped Mediterranean history so decisively disappeared even from human memory. But perhaps that is finally changing as research advances and discoveries multiply. The personal fates of individuals who lived through the collapse remain mostly unknown. We do not know what happened to the survivors of Wilusa after the sack. We cannot trace the journeys of specific Luwian families as they fled destruction. The archaeological evidence shows collective catastrophe, but rarely individual human stories. Occasionally, discoveries hint at personal tragedies preserved accidentally by circumstances. A woman buried in hasty flight with her jewelry clutched in her hands. A warrior's grave with wounds indicating death in desperate final battle. a seal fallen in a burning building as the owner fled flames. These glimpses of individual suffering remind us of the human cost behind the statistics. The collapse claimed countless lives in warfare, famine, disease, and displacement over decades. Millions died or suffered displacement from their homes and communities across the region. Families were separated never to reunite as populations scattered desperately. Children grew up in refugee camps or slavery far from their birthplaces. The elderly died without proper burial in conditions of chaos and breakdown. The sophisticated culture and knowledge accumulated over centuries was lost as elders died. The human cost in suffering, loss, and destroyed potential remains incalculable even today. This was not just political change, but humanitarian catastrophe on a massive scale. Yet human resilience eventually rebuilt civilization from the Bronze Age ruins slowly. The survivors adapted to new conditions and created new societies gradually. They passed down oral traditions, preserving memories of the lost age. They maintained some technologies and knowledge through the dark centuries that followed. They built new political systems and trade networks from scratch over generations. The classical civilizations that emerged centuries later grew from these humble origins. Greece, Phoenicia, Israel, and Persia all descended from the Bronze Age collapse's survivors. The catastrophe did not end human civilization, but transformed it fundamentally and permanently. The question of whether the collapse was inevitable or preventable haunts modern scholarship. Could different decisions by Bronze Age leaders have prevented the cascade toward disaster? Could the Luwian kingdoms have united more effectively against Greek aggression initially? Could the Hittites have intervened earlier to protect their Western vassals decisively? Could international diplomacy have resolved tensions before they escalated into total warfare? These counterfactual questions can never be answered definitively from surviving evidence, but they force us to consider how human choices shaped historical outcomes. The collapse was not simply natural disaster or inevitable historical force. It resulted partly from decisions made by individuals facing impossible choices. That reality makes the tragedy more poignant, but also more instructive for us. The archaeological sites scattered across Turkey preserve the physical remains of Luwian civilization. The ruins wait beneath olive groves, wheat fields, and modern villages. Most will never be excavated given limited funding and archaeological priorities. They exist as potential knowledge locked in the earth, waiting for discovery. Each site could reveal new information about this forgotten culture and society. Each excavation might find inscriptions, archives, or artifacts, changing our understanding fundamentally. The Luwians are being slowly recovered through patient scholarship and archaeological discovery. But much remains hidden and unknown even after a century of research. The true legacy was only beginning to emerge from the shadows of history. The true legacy was only beginning to emerge from the shadows of history. 4 centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, the Mediterranean world had transformed completely. The Phoenicians created a maritime trading network spanning 3 continents from collapsed ruins. The Greeks emerged from their Dark Age to colonize and establish the polis. The Assyrian Empire rose to dominate the Near East through military innovation. Iron replaced bronze as the dominant metal technology throughout the region. Alphabetic writing replaced syllabic scripts, making literacy more accessible broadly. The classical civilizations we recognize were taking shape from Bronze Age foundations. Yet none of these successor cultures remembered the Luwians who shaped their world. The Trojan War entered Greek cultural memory as foundational mythology and legend. Homer composed the Iliad and Odyssey around 750 BC, preserving oral traditions. The epics shaped Greek identity and values for all subsequent generations. Romans claimed descent from Trojan refugees, creating their own foundation myth. The story spread across Europe as classical literature influenced Western civilization. Countless writers, artists, and composers retold the Troy story through millennia. The Trojan War became one of Western culture's most enduring narratives. But the actual Luwian defenders were forgotten, even as their city became legendary. Modern Troy sits on a windswept hill in northwestern Turkey today. The archaeological site attracts tourists from around the world, annually seeking Homer's legends. A reconstructed wooden horse greets visitors at the entrance, symbolizing the famous stratagem. The excavated ruins reveal 9 major settlement layers spanning 4 millennia. Troy Sevander, destroyed around 1180 BC, matches the Trojan War's probable historical basis. But most visitors do not know they are walking through a Luwian city. The interpretive signs and museum displays rarely emphasize the civilization's Luwian identity. The disconnect between archaeology and popular understanding remains frustratingly large even today. Across Western Turkey, hundreds of Luwian sites remain buried and unexplored completely. Villages sit atop Bronze Age ruins, without residents knowing what lies beneath. Farmers plow fields containing pottery fragments and architectural stones annually. Satellite imagery reveals ancient settlement patterns invisible from ground-level observations. Archaeological surveys identify new sites every year as systematic exploration continues. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle of Luwian civilization's extent, but excavation resources remain limited compared to the number of known sites. Most Luwian cities will remain buried for the foreseeable future realistically. The civilization emerges slowly from the earth through patient scholarly efforts. The Luwian hieroglyphic script appears carved on rock faces throughout Anatolia's mountains. These inscriptions survived 3 millennia exposed to weather and human activity. They record royal achievements, territorial claims, and religious dedications from kings long forgotten. Scholars photograph and document these inscriptions before erosion destroys them completely. The decipherment allows us to read the ancient texts in the original language. We can hear Luwian kings speaking across the centuries in their own words. They describe their victories, their piety, and their territorial control with pride. These voices from the Bronze Age connect us directly to the forgotten civilization. Modern genetic studies reveal the Bronze Age population movements in biological evidence. DNA extracted from ancient remains confirms large-scale migrations during the collapse period. The genetic signatures show population replacement in some areas during the 12th century BC. Mediterranean populations today carry ancestry from Bronze Age refugees who survived the catastrophe. The Luwian descendants live on in modern Turkish, Greek, and Levantine populations. Their civilization disappeared, but their genetic legacy persists in millions of people. The biological evidence complements archaeological and textual evidence about the collapse's scope. The Bronze Age collapse offers urgent lessons for our interconnected modern world today. We face similar systemic vulnerabilities through global trade networks and economic integration. Climate change threatens agricultural production and social stability like Bronze Age drought did. Mass migrations from conflict and environmental stress destabilize regions and trigger political reactions. The international system depends on cooperation that can break down during crises. The parallels are not exact, but the patterns are disturbingly familiar. The Bronze Age world discovered how quickly sophisticated civilization can collapse under pressure. We would be wise to study their experience and learn from their fate. The Luwian case specifically teaches us about the danger of historical amnesia. An entire major civilization was forgotten so completely that scholars doubted it existed. The erasure was not deliberate conspiracy, but accumulated neglect over centuries. Later cultures simply did not maintain knowledge of peoples who preceded them. The Luwians left substantial physical remains and written records throughout their territory. Yet this was insufficient to prevent their disappearance from historical consciousness entirely. The lesson reminds us that historical knowledge requires active preservation and transmission. Nothing is so well documented that it cannot be forgotten by later generations. Recent discoveries continue changing our understanding of Luwian civilization and Bronze Age history. A 2019 excavation at Troy found additional Luwian seals confirming the city's identity. Surveys throughout Western Anatolia identified hundreds of previously unknown Luwian sites recently. New translations of Hittite texts reveal more details about Luwian kingdoms and diplomacy. Climate data confirms the drought severity during the collapse period precisely. Each discovery adds nuance to the narrative we can construct about the Luwians. The civilization becomes more complex and sophisticated as evidence accumulates steadily. The story is still being written through ongoing research and archaeological investigation. The scholarly debates about the Luwians and Bronze Age collapse remain vigorously active. Historians argue about the relative importance of different factors in the catastrophe. Archaeologists dispute dating, site identifications, and destruction layer interpretations regularly. Linguists debate Luwian language relationships and hieroglyphic readings at conferences. Climate scientists discuss the drought's severity and its effects on ancient societies. These debates are healthy signs of active scholarship advancing knowledge through evidence. The Luwians provoke passionate disagreement precisely because they matter so much historically. The stakes of understanding them correctly are high for Bronze Age history. The question of why historians overlooked the Luwians for so long invites reflection. Partly this resulted from the sources' biases and limitations we inherited. Greek and Roman sources focused on Greek achievements and perspectives naturally. Biblical texts emphasized Israel's neighbors but not distant Anatolian kingdoms. Egyptian records mentioned enemies but did not explain their origins or cultures fully. Mesopotamian texts focused on their own regional concerns predominantly. The Luwians fell between these major source traditions into historical gaps. Additionally, Luwian sites in Turkey were difficult for Western scholars to access. The combination of source gaps and access problems delayed recognition of their importance. The rise of Turkish archaeology since the early 20th century enabled Luwian rediscovery. Turkish scholars and institutions prioritized studying Anatolia's ancient past systematically. They welcomed international collaborations while maintaining sovereign control of heritage sites. The Turkish government funded excavations, surveys, and research into Anatolian civilizations. Museums in Ankara, Istanbul, and regional centers preserved and displayed Luwian artifacts. This institutional support made possible the scholarship recovering Luwian history gradually. The Luwian rediscovery demonstrates how archaeological knowledge depends on political and institutional support. Modern Turkey takes increasing pride in its ancient heritage, including Luwian civilization. Museums feature Luwian artifacts alongside better-known Hittite and classical Greek materials. Tourist promotion emphasizes Turkey's Bronze Age heritage alongside other historical attractions. Educational materials teach Turkish students about the ancient Anatolians who preceded later populations. This cultural reclamation gives the Luwians modern descendants who value their memory. The civilization no longer exists in isolation from living communities who care. Though the connection is not direct descent, modern Turks embrace Luwian heritage. This revival of interest ensures continued research and preservation of Luwian sites. The Trojan War's connection to real historical events inspires continued popular fascination. Films, novels, and television shows retell the Troy story to modern audiences. Each retelling interprets the legend through contemporary values and concerns somewhat differently. Some versions emphasize the violence and tragedy of war's consequences realistically. Others focus on heroism, love, or political intrigue as entertainment primarily. Few incorporate the Luwian historical reality behind Homer's mythologized narrative yet. But perhaps future retellings will include the civilization that actually built Troy. The story becomes richer when we understand the real cultures that clashed. The parallels between Bronze Age globalization and modern globalization provoke thoughtful comparison. Both eras feature extensive trade networks connecting distant regions economically. Both depend on specialized production and resource exchange across long distances. Both create wealth and cultural exchange through international connections and cooperation. Both generate vulnerabilities when disruptions cascade through the interconnected system rapidly. The Bronze Age collapse demonstrated how quickly prosperity can reverse into catastrophe. Our modern world faces similar systemic risks despite our superior technology. Understanding how the Bronze Age system failed helps us identify modern vulnerabilities. The refugee crisis that helped destroy the Bronze Age world resonates today. Modern conflicts and environmental stress create massive population displacements across regions. Millions of refugees seek safety and opportunity in foreign lands currently. Host communities struggle to integrate newcomers while maintaining social stability. The tensions generate political conflicts and humanitarian disasters across multiple continents. The Bronze Age Sea Peoples were similarly displaced people seeking survival desperately. Their migrations destabilized the entire Mediterranean world, contributing to civilization's collapse. The parallel warns us about how unmanaged migration crises can spiral catastrophically. Climate change, as a contributing factor to the Bronze Age collapse, offers warnings. The drought weakened Bronze Age societies, making them vulnerable to other stresses. Modern climate change threatens agricultural production, water supplies, and coastal populations. The potential for climate stress to compound other problems is significant today. The Bronze Age shows how environmental change can interact with political and social factors. The drought alone did not cause the collapse, but it made everything worse. Modern climate change may similarly amplify other risks we face contemporarily. The lesson encourages us to address climate threats seriously before cascading failures begin. Yet despite these sobering parallels, important differences separate our era from theirs. Our technology and knowledge give us capabilities the Bronze Age lacked entirely. We understand climate, economics, and society far better than they could. Our communication technology allows real-time coordination across the globe instantly. Our food production can sustain much larger populations through modern agriculture. Our institutions, though imperfect, are more robust than Bronze Age palace systems. We have the potential to avoid the Bronze Age civilization's fate if we choose wisely. But the potential exists only if we learn from history and act accordingly. Understanding the Luwians and the Bronze Age collapse helps us understand ourselves ultimately. We see how sophisticated civilizations can be forgotten completely within centuries. We recognize how interconnected systems create both prosperity and vulnerability simultaneously. We appreciate how human decisions shape historical outcomes alongside environmental and economic forces. We understand that civilization is not guaranteed, but requires maintenance and adaptation constantly. The Bronze Age was not primitive or simple, but complex and sophisticated. Its collapse was not inevitable, but resulted from choices and circumstances that compounded. The Luwians remind us that greatness does not ensure remembrance or survival. The forgotten civilization emerges from obscurity after 3,000 years, slowly but surely. Each excavation recovers another fragment of their story from the earth patiently. Each translated inscription adds another voice to the historical record gradually. Each scholarly article advances our understanding incrementally through evidence and argument. The Luwians are being restored to their rightful place in Bronze Age history. They were not peripheral players, but central actors in Mediterranean civilization's story. Their destruction triggered consequences that reshaped the ancient world permanently and dramatically. Their rediscovery changes how we understand an entire historical era fundamentally and completely. The story of the Luwians is ultimately a story about historical memory's fragility. Civilizations can disappear so thoroughly that later generations deny they ever existed. The physical remains and written records are insufficient without someone to preserve them. Historical knowledge requires active transmission across generations through education and scholarship. The Luwians vanished because no one maintained their memory after the collapse. Their rediscovery required archaeological science that did not exist until recently. We are privileged to witness a civilization returning from historical oblivion today. But their story warns us that our own age could similarly be forgotten. As you walk through the ruins of Luwian cities today, you walk among ghosts. The stones beneath your feet were shaped by Bronze Age masons 3 millennia ago. The pottery fragments in the earth were used by Luwian families in their daily lives. The inscriptions on rocks were carved by kings proclaiming their authority and achievements. These places were once alive with markets, temples, palaces, and homes. Children played in these streets while merchants conducted business in these squares. Then came the catastrophe that silenced the cities and scattered the people. For 3,000 years, the ruins waited for someone to remember and understand. Now that understanding is finally emerging from patient scholarship and archaeological discovery. The Luwians are coming home from the shadows of history. Their voices are being heard again after millennia of silence. And their story teaches us lessons we desperately need to learn today. Understanding this moment in Bronze Age history helps us understand ourselves better. We see that our prosperity is not guaranteed and our civilization is not eternal. We recognize that interconnected systems create risks alongside their benefits constantly. We appreciate that human choices matter in shaping historical outcomes decisively. We understand that maintaining civilization requires wisdom, cooperation, and adaptation continuously. The Luwians built a sophisticated culture that controlled an empire's worth of territory. They participated in international trade, diplomacy, and warfare with other great powers. They created art, architecture, and literature that shaped their world profoundly. Yet they vanished so completely that history forgot them for 3,000 years. If it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone, including us. That realization should inspire both humility about our achievements and determination to preserve them. The Bronze Age collapse warns us, while the Luwian rediscovery encourages us. We have the knowledge to avoid their fate if we have the wisdom to apply it. We have journeyed from Bronze Age prosperity through catastrophic collapse to modern rediscovery together. We have witnessed the Luwians rise from obscurity to become Mediterranean regional powers. We have seen how their destruction at Wilusa sparked a cascade of consequences. We have followed the Bronze Age civilization as it collapsed under multiple pressures. We have traced the long centuries when the Luwians were forgotten completely, and we have witnessed their dramatic return to historical consciousness through modern archaeology. The story is both tragic and hopeful in its implications for us today. The human cost of the Bronze Age collapse remains almost incomprehensible in its scale. Millions died or suffered displacement across the Mediterranean world during those terrible decades. Families were destroyed, communities were scattered, and knowledge was lost forever in the chaos. The suffering endured by individuals whose names we will never know was immense, yet from that catastrophe emerged new civilizations that shaped the classical world. The Greeks, Phoenicians, and Israelites all descended from Bronze Age survivors who persevered. Human resilience eventually rebuilt civilization from the ruins over generations of patient effort. The Luwian story reminds us that civilizations fall, but humanity endures and adapts. Much about the Luwians remains unknown and may always remain mysterious ultimately. Hundreds of their sites sit unexcavated beneath Turkish soil, waiting for future archaeologists. Archives may exist buried in palaces that would revolutionize our understanding completely. The language is understood, but many inscriptions remain untranslated and unread currently. The details of their religion, literature, and daily life are largely unknown still. Each new discovery raises new questions even as it answers old ones. The recovery of the Luwians will continue for decades as research and excavation proceed. Future generations will know much more than we do today, inevitably and certainly. The Luwians deserve to be remembered alongside the Egyptians, Hittites, and Mycenaeans today. They built a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization that controlled strategic territory for centuries. They participated in the international diplomacy and trade that defined their era. They fought to defend their independence against foreign conquest and aggression. Their destruction contributed to the Bronze Age collapse that transformed the Mediterranean world. Their descendants became the Sea Peoples who invaded Egypt and the Levant. Their memory was erased so thoroughly that historians denied they existed for millennia. Now they are returning to their rightful place in history through archaeological science. We witness a forgotten civilization's resurrection in real time through ongoing research and discovery. The ruins scattered across western Turkey stand as monuments to the Luwian achievement. The massive walls of Troy that withstood siege for 8 years remain partially standing. The rock inscriptions carved by Luwian kings still proclaim their authority to anyone who reads. The pottery, seals, and artifacts in museums preserve their artistic traditions and craftsmanship. These physical remains connect us across 3,000 years to a vanished people. When you visit these sites, you walk where Luwians walked in the Bronze Age. When you read their inscriptions, you hear their voices speaking across the millennia. The past is not truly past when its traces remain in the present. The Luwians live on through the evidence they left behind for us to discover. The sun sets over the ruins of Troy on Turkey's northwestern coast. The massive stone walls catch the golden light as shadows lengthen. The Dardanelles gleam in the distance, where Luwian ships once controlled the straits. The wind blows across the empty plain where Greek and Luwian armies clashed. The silence is profound in this place, where a civilization fell 3,000 years ago. But now we know who built these walls and who defended them. We know they were Luwians fighting for their cities, their families, their civilization. We remember them now, even though they were forgotten for 3 millennia. Their story has returned from the shadows of history to teach us. And as long as we remember and learn from them, the Luwians truly live. Civilizations are not killed, they commit suicide. Arnold Toynbee. The Bronze Age collapse resulted from choices as much as circumstances. The Luwians were destroyed, but the collapse was not inevitable. Humanity can learn from this catastrophe and avoid repeating it. Understanding the past empowers us to shape the future differently. The Luwians teach us this lesson from 3,000 years in the past. May we have the wisdom to heed their warning today. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.